Hey there, it's Alex Campbell for PC Gamer, and this is a quick guide to optimizing your graphic settings in Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. If you've played a Call of Duty title before, this installment, set in the Cold War era, will feel pretty familiar. There's a campaign, multiplayer, and of course, zombies. If you're somehow new to the franchise, Call of Duty is a military-themed first-person shooter that plays like you're in the middle of an action film. An action film that features an uncanny valley version of Ronald Reagan. Like most Calls of Duty, Cold War isn't at the absolute cutting edge of graphical fidelity, but it remains a nice-looking blockbuster nevertheless. Cold War pulls this off while making the game accessible to most GPUs on the market. One thing to note about tweaking the game settings, although Cold War settings are deeper and more descriptive than average, there aren't really any graphics presets to choose from. Graphics options have to be manipulated individually. Every GPU in our lineup managed to do just fine at 1080p with common graphic settings maxed out. To keep those settings maxed out at 4K and still maintain a frame rate of over 30 frames per second, you'll need at least an NVIDIA RTX 2070 or an AMD RX 5700 XT. At 1440p, even the NVIDIA GTX 1660 Ti and AMD RX 580 were quite happily above 30 frames per second. Cold War does include the setting for render scaling. So if your frame rate is dropping just below your target, try dropping render scaling down to 90 or 85. Deep Learning Super Sampling is an NVIDIA feature only available on RTX GPUs. With DLSS set to balanced, the NVIDIA RTX 2060 saw an 83% increase in frame rate at 4K, jumping from 30 frames per second to 55 frames per second, with all other settings staying the same. That's huge. Keep in mind that DLSS manages render scaling itself, so if you select a DLSS mode, it will disable the render scaling slider. One thing you should be on the lookout for is what textures and models are in use. If you download the HD textures and models, those assets do look great, however they do take up a lot more VRAM. One of the keys to Cold War is the VRAM usage. Even the GTX 1650 has a decent performance until you fill up its measly 4GB of VRAM, at which point it begins to choke. To manage this, keep an eye on the bar of the lower right hand of the graphics settings screen. It'll tell you how much VRAM you're asking for versus how much you actually have. A good rule to follow is to keep VRAM use below 80%. The HD textures and models are only used when the options are set to ultra and high respectively. While the HD models make the game geometry look better, keeping the texture quality set to high, which does not use the HD textures, is actually fine, even at 4K. Ray tracing helps a lot of the objects and shadows in Cold War really pop. But here's the rub. Ray tracing is expensive. The GTX 1660 Ti does technically allow for ray tracing. However, when it was activated, I saw a 64% drop in frame rate from 75 frames per second to 27 frames per second at 1080p. Not recommended. However, if you have an NVIDIA GPU that can also support DLSS, I highly recommend pairing it with ray tracing. For example, the RTX 2080 managed 83 frames per second at 1440p as a baseline. When ray tracing options were set to high, the frame rate dropped to 49 frames per second, a 41% loss. But when DLSS was enabled and set to balance, the frame rate jumped up to 59 frames per second, resulting in a 29% loss from baseline. There are a bunch of other graphic settings to tweak as well, but the majority of them won't have as much of an impact on performance. If you want the real skinny on how to keep the game high speed and low drag, here it is. Keep the resolution appropriate. Not all GPUs are meant for 4K. If HD assets are too much, try using the non-HD but still high quality textures first. If you want to use ray tracing, be aware of the performance hit it will inflict, and definitely don't attempt ray tracing with a card more than a couple years old. If you need to eke out a higher frame rate due to ray tracing or using HD assets, try lowering the render scaling value below 100. If you have an NVIDIA GPU that supports DLSS, set it to balanced. And that's it for now. For more in-depth details about how Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War was benchmarked and how our GPUs performed, head over to PCGamer.com. This is Echo 4 Charlie, out.